Let me bring in former Liberal MP and former Australian ambassador to Israel, Dave Sharma. Dave, welcome to the program.
Evening, Chris.
You've lived that life. You've lived in that part of the world. You understand that threat intimately. Now, the response, these attacks in Jerusalem came after Israeli forces went into the West Bank and took out militants, terrorists. Right. It's a never-ending cycle, isn't it?
Yeah, look, this is the worst I've seen it in several years. I mean, probably since 2014 when there was the last major eruption of violence. I mean, there was the Israeli raid on Jenin, a settlement there, targeting Palestinian Islamic Jihad militants, resulted in 10 deaths, I think including at least one civilian bystander out of that. And then, of course, there was an awful attack by terrorists on a synagogue of Jerusalem, just outside the suburbs of Jerusalem. And the risk with these things, of course, is that people start to take things into their own hands. We've already started to see that with that 13-year-old boy, but also on the Israeli side where people conduct reprisal attacks on their own behalf, and it takes on a life of its own.
We can see the armed Israelis there. If they hadn't have been there, more people would have been killed. But we know that Benjamin Netanyahu is a strong man and he will retaliate against presumably what are militant targets. But then we expect, of course, there'll be more reprisals from the occupied territories, missiles and the like. Do you fear that this is the beginning of a new escalation?
Look, I do fear that. And I think it's important to remember, look, Gaza's a little separate here. Gaza's run by Hamas, committed to Israel's destruction. They're always looking for an opportunity to start a fight with Israel if they think they can inflict some damage, and they'll be looking at that now. The West Bank, which is where most of the Palestinian population lives, has been, relatively speaking, much more peaceful in Gaza since the Second Intifada. And that's because of security cooperation between Palestinian security forces and Israeli security forces. If that breaks down, and this is what Abbas is saying he's going to suspend, then we could be looking at something like another intifada where there's terrorism, there's attacks in Jerusalem on Israeli civilians, there's reprisal attacks, and we could really see it spin out of control. So I think it's a pretty tense time right there now.
So Antony Blinken flies in. The US always gets involved in this. What can he reasonably be expected to do?
Well, look, his message to both sides will be to walk this one back, to exercise restraint in the diplomatic phrase. He'll try and give the Palestinians, I think, some hope that there will be a political process in the offing, because I think they do need that. They need some sort of political horizon, and only the US can provide that. But he'll also be telling them to rein in their own people. And on the Israeli side, he'll be asking them to exercise, not interrupting their right to go after these militants, but to ask them to exercise a high degree of caution to make sure that they're not getting innocent civilians caught up in these attacks.
Now, meantime, while this has been going on, not enough people in the world have noticed an attack, explosions in Iran, at a military facility in Iran. It seems obvious that Israeli forces, secret forces, have managed to destroy an Iranian military factory, for want of a better word, possibly involved in its nuclear program.
Yeah, so the attack was in Isfahan, which is a site where Iran has nuclear facilities. It was seemingly on some sort of depot or ammunition or research facility. Usual pattern of these things, of course, is that Israel does not confirm or deny, doesn't comment on these things, but the Wall Street Journal has reports suggesting it's Israel behind this. It was involving unmanned quadcopters, drones, effectively. And it's got all the hallmarks of this sort of cold conflict that has been going on underway between Israel and Iran for some time.
This is where it gets very complex, though, doesn't it? Because isn't this one of the things Netanyahu says to Blinken? Well, if you want to try and us to show restraint here with our neighbours, you've got to help do more to rein in Iran.
Look, this is a big agenda for Netanyahu, Iran. It's always been one of his biggest focuses as Prime Minister. Just last week, the US and Israel held their largest ever joint military exercises, doing things like air-to-air refuelling, the sorts of things that would be involved in a military strike against Iran's nuclear facilities. And I think with the diplomatic track, this is the idea to resurrect the P5+1 Iran nuclear agreement dead. The Biden administration is going to need to come up with other options to address Iran's nuclear program.
Worrying stuff indeed, worrying indeed. Now, let's get back to the domestic scene. You're out of politics for now, you might go back, who knows. Do you think the Liberal Party should support an Indigenous voice to Parliament?
Look, my own view is, firstly, that I think the party should come to a position on this, and I think the party can.
Just let me interrupt there. You mean not just leave it as a conscience vote, have everybody voting in one way?
Yeah, that's my view, because I don't think this is a matter of, individual conscience. I think it's a constitutional change, and generally speaking, I know the Republic was a little different, but generally speaking, the history there has been to for the party to reach a position. Look, I would like to be in a position to vote in favour of the voice, but I am yet to be reassured by some of the detail. And my main concern is not an unusual one. It's that if Indigenous people have a voice on issues that pertain only to them, of course, that's, I think, logical and sensible. But if Indigenous people have a privileged voice on issues that pertain to all Australians, and which gives them a particular channel which other Australians lack, then I worry about what it does to our concept of citizenship.
I think if that was the case, I'm quite relaxed about that, because I think if there was an Indigenous voice and it started to tell us what to do in foreign policy or in defence policy, it would make itself irrelevant. No government in the public debate wouldn't take that seriously. I mean, they've really got to stick to their remit or they'll make themselves easily ignored.
Look, I think that's probably correct, but you've got to remember we're putting this in the Constitution. The High Court will have a role in interpreting the scope of that. And the High Court would be free to say that the government is failing to pay proper heed to the voice, it's unreasonable in its rejection of the articulated views of the voice, or any number of things. So I worry that we're putting something that should stay in the political realm potentially into the realm of the judiciary. And as a democratic politician, I'm not particularly comfortable with that.
Yeah, well said. I'd be more comfortable about it all if it was being introduced by a Conservative government. Always get worried when it's progressive, so-called progressive governments that are marshalling these things. We'll see how it all goes. Thanks for joining us, Dave.
Thanks, Chris, for having me on.
Dave Sharma there, former Liberal MP, but more importantly in the context of that discussion, former Australian ambassador to Israel.